Hello, and welcome to this online resource on writing for the academic job market, focusing on diversity statements. My name is Erica, and I'm with the Writing Hub as part of the Teaching and Learning Commons, and we built this resource in collaboration with the Engaged Teaching Hub, also part of the Teaching and Learning Commons. Okay, so here's how this online resource is going to work. In part one, we have a video talking about why diversity statements are useful and important in faculty job searches. And then part one is followed up by a worksheet where you can spend some time on reflecting on your experiences, thinking about what you might want to write about in your diversity statement. In part two of this resource, we have, again with the video, some general guidelines for organizing and selecting experiences and writing about those experiences in the statement, and followed up with a worksheet on thinking about the experiences and how you might organize them in your draft. And then part three of this resource has a video where we address some common questions that we've received in our workshops on the diversity statement, and we offer some strategies for drafting, revising, and getting feedback on your work. Okay, let's get started with part one. So in this part of the resource, I'm going to talk about some of the larger context for thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education and how that comes to inform the diversity statement as a genre of writing. And then we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about how you might reflect on your experiences as they are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just want to add a quick disclaimer that lots of us have very different experiences with diversity statements and with this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. We can't assume where you are, the person watching this. So what we are assuming in this resource is that you are part of an audience that wants to learn more about both the statement and also about the broader context for why these statements are asked or asked for from applicants. I want to say use only what is helpful for you. If you find something in here that is not quite relevant or not quite useful for you, feel free to just ignore it. Take what's useful and leave the rest. Okay, let's get started with part one. So here's some context for thinking about diversity statements. Many but not all institutions will require some kind of diversity, quote unquote, diversity statement as part of the application process, both for applying to faculty positions as well as probably applying to their graduate programs and maybe even their undergraduate programs. I say this statement goes by many names. It might be called a DEI statement, an EDI statement, an equity statement, something like that. But the central question for something called a diversity statement is basically the same, no matter what it's called. Have you thought carefully about how you will contribute to institutional efforts towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice? And I highlight these different words on purpose. Have you thought carefully, meaning have you spent some time brainstorming and thinking about your role in creating an institutional environment of inclusion and a campus that values diversity and equity? Have you thought about how you will contribute to those efforts and what you specifically will be able to do in your role based on what you're applying for? In this case, we're going to assume that you are applying for faculty job positions. So no matter what your institution calls this thing, the institution that you're applying for anyway, remember that this is the central question that you are considering. Have you thought carefully about how you will contribute to institutional efforts towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice? And in case you're not entirely familiar with these words, we're going to use some of these definitions from UCLA. If you are applying to an institution, I do recommend that you do some homework and think about how that institution defines these terms or what terms they use. So again, whenever you're writing a statement like this for an application, you want to be carefully considering the context of your audience and doing your best to make your words and terms speak to the and be relevant to that particular audience in their context. But here we'll offer some definitions from UCLA. So equity just means treating likes alike. In other words, if two candidates provide the same performance, give them the same score. On a more substantive level, though, equity means not ignoring differences when they matter. If two candidates look roughly the same with respect to their formal credentials, but one navigated a more difficult trajectory laden with obstacles or additional responsibilities, equity requires taking those differences into account. So equity means being mindful of individual experiences and not putting people together in the same category if they have really importantly different experiences. Diversity, on the other hand, refers to the variety of personal experiences, values, and worldviews that arrive from differences of culture and circumstance. Such differences include race, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, language, abilities, disabilities, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, and geographic region, and more. So diversity has to do with the range of human experiences that are out there, and we want to build campuses that have a lot of different diversity and different kinds of experiences represented so that we can benefit from having a lot of different kinds of perspectives in building our institution. Inclusion exists when all faculty members, regardless of their social identities, feel welcomed, respected, and valued. Even when we achieve equity in the hiring process and diversity on the faculty roster, full inclusion does not necessarily follow. The truth is that an institution can be diverse and uninclusive at the same time. Why? Because representation may feel formal and begrudging and may engender a sense of non-belonging. So what's important about inclusion is that this has to do more with the environment and the climate of a campus or a department, and whether or not that climate equally values, respects, and seeks out and invites different perspectives of different kinds of folks from diverse backgrounds. So it's one thing to have equity in our decision-making process, and it's another thing to have diversity in the people who are represented in our spaces. But if those individuals and if that equity isn't yielding a more inclusive environment where people's attitudes and beliefs and experiences are respected and valued, then we're not quite doing what we want, which is to build an inclusive and beneficial institution for as many people as possible. So I want to talk a little bit more about that context and why we should care about equity, diversity, and inclusion in faculty searches. So it's important to recognize that diverse perspectives and backgrounds do make us smarter. This has been a phenomenon that's been studied, that when you have more perspectives in a room, the solutions to problems are more innovative and interesting, they are more useful for more people, and diversity in general just helps us see the world in a more nuanced and beneficial way, and that helps us be not only smarter as individuals, but to create better institutions and departments. It's also important to recognize in a higher ed context that the undergraduate and graduate student population is growing more increasingly diverse. So for example, we're getting more diverse in terms of racial and ethnic identities, gender identities and expressions, class backgrounds, and family experiences. There's also some other characteristics that might be pretty interesting here. So about 2/3 of undergraduate students are first generation. About 2/3 of undergraduate students will at some point transfer between institutions and or work part-time or full-time during their educational experience. And about 1/4 of students, undergraduate students, have dependents, so children or relatives that are legally classified as their dependent relatives. So it's important to recognize that even though our campuses are getting increasingly diverse, both in terms of identities as well as in terms of experiences, opportunity gaps for lots of different kinds of students remain. And that's why equity and inclusion are also important. So when you're thinking about your statement, you want to be thinking about all of these different terms and what it means in the context of higher education, that we have opportunity gaps for different kinds of students from different kinds of backgrounds, and what your role might be as a faculty in shaping that. And that's important because higher education matters. And you may or may not be used to thinking about higher education in this way, so I'm going to spend just a moment thinking about why higher education matters. Higher education and institutions of higher education, like universities, are really powerful institutions in society. They generate social mobility, and they also become places where intergenerational inequality can be reproduced. Higher education is immensely powerful for achieving social mobility in the United States as well as in other places, and your role as a faculty helps shape that institutional environment. Right, so this comes from a Department of Education report that when a person completes a degree, especially if they are the first person in their family or their ancestral lineage to complete a college degree, that helps them or influences whether or not they attain social mobility. Of course, it's not the only influencing factor, but it is one very powerful influencing factor in terms of the jobs they're able to get, other sort of educational experiences they're able to achieve, which will impact their family resources, which will then impact their children and their children's aspiration for education and access and different kinds of careers. All of these this cycle of experiences really matters. So our role when we think about what we do in institutions of higher education is to ask ourselves how we are contributing to this institution that has immense social consequences for people. Now, this may not be new to you depending on the kind of discipline you come from or the kinds of department you come from, but it's important for all of us to recognize that when we're in an institution of higher education, a university, it's not just an intellectual space. It's not just where we go to do interesting research or work in a lab or publish interesting things or teach students about our discipline or about how to think and do research projects in our disciplines. It is a social institution. In the act of doing all those things, researching and teaching and service, we are contributing to this institution that has immense social consequences for people. And so we should ask ourselves questions about the institution that we're working in and what we are doing within that institution to make it a more accessible and inclusive place. So we should ask ourselves questions whether we're in a dance studio or a lab or some kind of seminar room. Who has access to this place? Who do I see around here? Who do I not see represented in this place? Who is finishing my program? Who's doing well in my courses? Who's incurring a lot of cost to be here, whether that's actual costs in terms of the monetary cost of education or the cost of materials for education like books, but also other relative costs. Who's incurring time away from their family or who's feeling socially isolated, and that's a cost that they're paying for their educational experience. We should all be looking around our day-to-day work in the institution and asking ourselves, who is included here and who is being potentially excluded here, because that matters for our general society and our societal health. Okay, so what does this mean for you? You're just one person writing a diversity statement for the job market. I get it. So how does this relate to you and your writing experience for this statement? I'm going to ask you to consider one more thing, and that is look at the racial and ethnic diversity in our undergraduate enrollment versus faculty. So you might notice that in undergraduate enrollment, there is still predominantly more than half of the students are white. However, when you look at what changes between undergraduate students and the faculty level, white faculty become the overwhelming majority. This also holds true at the graduate level, so we can see the difference between undergraduate enrollment here and what happens in diversity at the graduate level. So you can already see a sort of shrinking diversity in terms of race and ethnicity at the graduate level, and then that continues to shrink at the faculty level. This is sometimes called the leaky pipeline in academia. Okay, so what does this mean for you again? I want to say at the bare minimum, it means we should be creating an inclusive environment for the undergraduate students and graduate students that we serve. That's the bare minimum. But we might also want to consider how we contribute to the diversity or the inclusion at the faculty level, and what we might be able to do to address the leaky pipeline problem, or how we might create better institutions for different kinds of students so that they might aspire to become faculty one day. It's important to remember that as a member of this profession, as a professional in higher education, making education equitable and inclusive is your business. This is true regardless of your discipline. So sometimes I think folks think that this is something that social scientists think lots about, and how would an engineer or a biologist be thinking about this? But this is true for everyone regardless of your discipline, because your discipline and department still educates people. So even if your research isn't about issues of social inequality or social justice, even if you study something highly technical and specific, your work in your discipline, your work in your department is still involved in that institution of higher education. It's still part of this place that we're building that we call an institution of higher ed. And so your work in that discipline and department is still relevant for making the institution a more equitable and inclusive place. And as a faculty in particular, you will have a role in shaping students' opportunities, access, their success, and attainment, both for your students in your courses, graduate students you might advise, and colleagues in your department, professional colleagues. You have a professional role to play in other people's experiences, so you might think about what you will do as a result of that role. And depending on the identity that you have, you might bring a very different kind of relationship to writing this statement and thinking about these ideas. I'll say this for now. If your identities or your backgrounds are underrepresented in the faculty or in the campus environment broadly, consider how that underrepresentation has shaped your experiences, has shaped your approach, and also consider how it will shape your experience or how it will shape your approach to becoming a member of this profession. How will that change you? What will you do differently because that's the identity that you have? On the other hand, if you feel that you are largely represented and in fact maybe overrepresented in institutions of higher education, and if you have experienced some privilege or advantage in your life, remember that you are not immune from quote unquote diversity work. It is especially relevant for you to consider how you can use that privilege and how you can use that access to change the institution to make it more inclusive and equitable for different kinds of students and different kinds of experiences. So whatever experience or identity you bring to writing this statement, you do want to remember that this is everyone's job in education. However, not everyone has traditionally done quote unquote diversity work. Especially folks who have been underrepresented in the faculty often find themselves overloaded with certain kinds of diversity work, whether that's official mentoring or advising of students, unofficial mentoring or advising of students, being involved in different committees and different service efforts depending on the institution or the department. And so even though it is everyone's job to do the work of creating a more diverse and inclusive institution, not everyone has done that equally or equitably. And so diversity statements are a way of acknowledging and rewarding this work. As the UCLA Vice Chancellor for EDI stated, the statement gives credit for otherwise invisible and uncredited work. So it really legitimizes this work in an important way. You can also consider these statements as a kind of truth in advertising. So this comes from, I believe, Inside Higher Ed, where it doesn't quite make sense to affirm diversity as underpinning the institutional mission, while not giving candidates the opportunity to talk about and be credited for their efforts. So this is a way of holding people accountable to the things the institution says it values. And also remember that diversity statements can be really helpful in just the brainstorming and thinking stage, because diversity statements, the fact of diversity statements being required means more people are thinking and having conversations about their role in shaping and improving education. So diversity statements are beneficial not only as a mechanism for communicating what you have done or what you intend to do or what is important to you with regard to these topics. They're also a way to start thinking carefully. They are a catalyst for thinking and for awareness and for growth and exploration, including internal exploration. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind with diversity statements, is that through this process of thinking and having conversation, you should learn something about yourself and then think about how you might communicate that to an audience through your writing. Okay, so I recognize that that's a lot, and you might be thinking, but where do I start? Where do I begin? And I want to say you should begin with yourself. Start thinking about you, your experiences, your identities, your backgrounds, and how they might have shaped your educational experience and how they have shaped what you, or how they will shape what you intend to do if and when you become a faculty at another institution. So here's your goal in a diversity statement. And I'll say we are going to explore each of these more in part 2 of this resource. But in your statement, you want to show your reader an authentic view into how you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and/or educational justice. based on a curated retelling of some of your experiences and what you've learned from those experiences that reflects an awareness of your future role in shaping and contributing to educational access, opportunity, and attainment at your reader's institution. So what might you talk about in order to achieve these purposes? What kind of experiences might you bring to bear? What might you discuss? So I want to say that lots of different experiences can be relevant here because we live very multi-dimensional lives. And so all of those different aspects of our experiences can be relevant in this genre. That's part of what makes this genre kind of confusing, is it's hard to know what you should write about or what you could write about. So remember that you come from a past, you come from a family, a geographical location, and you've had impactful educational experiences in your life. You also have a present, you have a community, you have your work, whatever that work means to you. We'll talk about that in a moment. You have your passions, the values that you hold, the things that you're interested in, and whatever family experience you're currently having. And you also have a future. So you have goals that you want to achieve and intentions that you want to put towards your work, priorities that you will decide to emphasize in your life in accordance, hopefully, to your values, both your professional values and personal values. And then, of course, you want to be thinking about how all of these things might inform your experiences or understandings, and especially your experience of education. Remember that the diversity statement is a higher ed kind of genre. You are writing this for institutions of higher education, for audience who work in those kinds of institutions of education. So thinking especially about how your experiences have shaped your experience of education can be especially important. And it's also important to keep in mind that we do different kinds of work. Even the work that you do as a graduate student, as a postdoc, or as a junior faculty is multidimensional. So there's teaching and mentoring. You can be thinking about the teaching that you do in groups or one-on-one. Research, whether that's the topics of your research or how you conduct and carry out research with collaborators and colleagues and coworkers. Service related to your department, to your professional discipline, or to your campus. So all of these different aspects of your life, both your past, your present, your future, as well as the different dimensions of your professional role, can all be relevant to your diversity statement. So how do you choose? How do you choose what's most relevant? Well, I have bad news and good news. The good news is, or the bad news and the good news are actually the same, that it's up to you really. In one study, statements were all over the map in terms of content. They cover lots of different kinds of ground. But I think what's most important is that in your statement, you want to demonstrate deep engagement. So the thing that is the good news is this is really up to you, and you should decide the experiences that are most authentic and meaningful to you to discuss in this statement. So don't try to toe a line or embrace a single ideology, but demonstrate deep engagement with your students, campus, and community. There can be no single model for this, because what constitutes diversity, equity, and inclusion in the rehearsal room, science lab, playing field, library, lecture hall, or seminar room will differ by discipline and instructor. So the most important thing is for you to think about is what's important to me and how do I want to convey that? Remember that there's no set range of different experiences, that the content of what's in this diversity statement is really wide. And so you have a lot of room to decide what's important for you to discuss. So I think now is a good time for you to look at the Part 1 worksheet that goes along with this resource. So go ahead and go back to click on the Part 1 worksheet, which will take you to a Word file. You can download that Word file and spend some time free writing responses to the questions. I'll say about the worksheets that they are mostly for you, they're for your benefit. You can use what's useful, ignore what isn't. Feel free to add sections to the worksheet if you want. No one will read or judge what's in your worksheet. This is just for you to explore and to think about your ideas. I would recommend spending some time in the brainstorming stage for this diversity statement, because what you're trying to do is show how you think. It's worthwhile to spend some time thinking about what you think. It will only benefit you when it comes to drafting and revising the statement to get really clear on some of your ideas and what you might explore. And so don't be worried about spending too much time in the thinking and planning and brainstorming stage. It will help you. So take a moment and look at this worksheet and explore in there and free write to the extent that you want. And when you're ready, you can move on to the part 2 video.